Well, it's hard to get a handle on that number around the world. Obviously, in countries like China, as you just reported, in Italy, there are mass closures all across the country. Here in the United States, it's much more spotty. There are individual schools that have closed as cases have been discovered or people have been exposed, but there haven't been mass closings here in the United States yet like there have been in other countries.
Now, do you know what lessons can be learned from previous health emergencies? For example, do these school closures really help in terms of containing the spread of the virus?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on public health, but based on past experiences, that is a tool that I think most school districts will be looking at, particularly if they get that advice from their local public health departments. One advantage we have today over past outbreaks is that there's much broader internet connectivity, so if students do have to learn at a distance, there will be much more bandwidth available to many of them, though it's certainly not universal even in the United States.
And so then how prepared would you say communities are for the possibility of remote learning, even if they do have the internet access? I mean, are teachers prepared? Are there systems in place?
Well, it's really going to vary from school to school and from university to university. I think some schools may be much better prepared. They may have better technology within the school and available to their students and their teachers. Other schools, particularly those in more rural areas, poorer schools, are not going to have the kind of bandwidth, they're not going to have the kind of technology, and more importantly, the training for faculty and staff to be able to move quickly online if necessary.
And in terms of obviously having children at home, especially if it's for younger students, do we know how employers are trying to manage this? Are they providing parents with some sort of flexible sort of scheduling to be able to take care of the children?
Well, I think many employers are going to have to do that. Here in the Bay Area, a lot of the big tech companies have already asked their employees to start working at home. That wasn't because they had children at home, but because of public health concerns and to try to curtail spread of the coronavirus. So at this point, I think many employers are really looking at that possibility and getting ready to deal with it if there are going to be millions of students here in the United States at home, sent home from school.
Now, homeschooling is a system that's been around for a long time as an alternative to traditional in-classroom settings. What kind of systems are there for emergency distance learning situations like we're seeing with the coronavirus?
Well, I don't think most school districts, frankly, have had preparatory plans like this in case of a public health disaster or some other kind of disaster. So I think most students are going to be scrambling to try to deal with something on the kind of scale we're looking at here.
And obviously schools aren't just where children get educated, it's considered a place of security, and it's also where some children also rely on the food that's provided there. Do we know anything about the sort of non-educational challenges and support for students?
Well, a lot of it depends upon how long this goes. I mean, it's one thing if schools are shut down for a week or two. It's another thing if it's from now till the end of the school year or even longer. So I think if it does tend to be a longer shutdown, most schools are going to be thinking about the kind of out-of-classroom experiences as well as the in-classroom learning that goes on to try to figure out how best to support the development of students outside of the classroom, things like nutritional needs, physical exercise for gym and things like that. Those are all important. And the longer this goes on for, the longer schools are going to have to figure out how to deal with these issues.
And a lot of people take for granted that, you can just sort of have a laptop handy, have internet access handy, but what about the long-term effect on learning and the ability to keep up with the curriculums, being that everyone has different levels of access?
Right. We really don't have a lot of research on this, on coping in an emergency basis. We certainly have good research on online learning and how it affects different types of students, but we don't really have much research on how to deal with or looking at how schools deal with emergencies like this, particularly, as I said, if it stretches out for a longer period of time. This is really uncharted territory for most schools and educators.
And since this is uncharted, do we know anything about the sort of residual impact that can come for a community when you have school closures and you're worried about things like the social spread of a virus?
Well, we do have some analogs to that. For example, areas that have had natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things like that, where they've had to close schools for a long time. One of the things we learned is that most communities are very resilient and they figure out how to deal with catastrophes like this and in particular protect the interests of children.
And so what can parents do to prepare in case that their school does get closed?
Well, first and foremost, thinking about the technology needs and, whether students are going to have access to the technology they need to be able to learn online, because that's going to be the modality that most schools turn to is online learning. Things like that, smaller things like school supplies. Can you get together with neighbors and get groups of children together in small groups to learn together? Even that can be an advantage over isolating every single student in their own home.